I got into a serious accident. The doctor called my son. Your mother urgently needs surgery, otherwise she won't survive. My son replied, I'm at my mother-in-law's birthday party. If she dies, tell me later. A few hours later, I regained consciousness. The doctor smiled and said, Your son has no idea who you really are, right? Greetings, dear listeners. Before I begin telling this complicated story of my life, I ask you to support our channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy listening. My name is Mary Walker. I am 68 years old, and I have spent my life surviving moments that would crush ordinary people. War, loss, heartbreak, poverty. I thought I had endured the worst. But nothing, not the shrapnel that tore through buildings, not the nights of unbearable grief, could have prepared me for that night. The rain was relentless, painting the asphalt in streaks of silver. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white with the effort of maintaining control. Headlights flickered against puddles, and the hum of the engine was a lullaby that usually soothed my nerves. But that night, calm was a fragile illusion. The truck appeared suddenly, a monstrous shadow in the blur of darkness. There was no time to react. Metal screamed against metal, a sound so violent it seemed to echo inside my skull. The force of the collision threw me sideways, wrenching my body against the seatbelt, crushing my legs and ribs. Pain erupted in waves, each sharper than the last, jagged and raw. I tasted blood, warm and metallic, before I even realized it was mine. The world dissolved into fragments. Rain-streaked windows, ambulance lights flashed in the wet night, and every sense was overwhelmed. My body became unrecognizable, a cage of broken bones and bruised muscles. I was conscious, yet trapped, aware yet powerless. Every attempt to move was agony. Every breath burned like fire in my lungs. Paramedics arrived with practiced urgency. Their voices were calm, clipped, but behind them, I sensed the tension, the understanding that this situation was life-threatening. Keep her still. Pressure on the wound. Legs immobilized. Their hands moved with precision, lifting, pulling, checking. The stretcher became my temporary coffin, rolling me through the storm towards salvation, though it did not feel like salvation at all. Inside the ambulance, the siren tore through the night, slicing through the sound of relentless rain. Every jolt of the vehicle sent shocks through my shattered body. My consciousness flickered between clarity and darkness, awareness and void. I glimpsed the paramedics' faces, taut with focus, heard their murmured instructions, smelled the antiseptic that clung to everything, tasted the copper of blood still flooding my mouth. The pain was constant, a brutal companion that allowed no relief. At the hospital, chaos consumed me. Fluorescent lights stabbed my vision, doors banged, monitors beeped in urgent rhythms, and doctors and nurses moved around me in a coordinated frenzy. I felt hands tugging at my clothes, pulling, probing, pricking. Needles bit into my skin, and machines hissed and clicked as if mocking my helplessness. Every sound, every motion intensified the storm inside me. Then, above the cacophony, a voice rang out, cold and commanding. Call her next of kin, her son. She needs emergency surgery now, or she won't make it. David, my son, the one I had spent a lifetime raising, protecting, nurturing, the one whose face had been etched into my soul since his first cries. I tried to breathe, tried to speak, tried to summon any part of me capable of moving toward hope, but my body refused. The fear that he might not answer, might not care, clawed at my chest with merciless claws. Somewhere, a phone rang. Somewhere, a message was about to be delivered. Somewhere, my fate would hang, not only on skilled hands and surgical expertise, but on my son's choices, on whether he would recognize the fragility of the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. A paramedic placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding me in the middle of the storm. "Stay with us, Mary," he said. His voice was firm, gentle, a tether to a world I was not ready to leave. I clung to it, desperately, because survival was not just about escaping death. It was about enduring the betrayal, the indifference, the cold realities of those we love most. As I drifted in and out of consciousness, the fear of abandonment settled into my bones. Survival, I realized, was never purely physical. It was mental, emotional, moral. To survive meant to endure not only pain, but the cruelty of chance, the betrayal of those we hold dear, the shock of realizing that life could turn on a single moment, a single act of indifference. And so I lay there, suspended between pain and awareness, between life and death, waiting for the next heartbeat, the next decision, the next move in a world that had suddenly become far crueler than I had ever imagined. Consciousness came and went in thin, unreliable strands, like a frayed rope slipping through my hands. Every time I surfaced, the pain greeted me first, sharp, insistent, pulsing like a warning bell inside my broken ribs. Then came the sounds, the beeping machines, the shuffle of shoes on linoleum, the clipped urgency of medical voices that seemed to be speaking around me, over me, through me, as if I were both present and already halfway gone. I couldn't see clearly. My eyelids felt glued down by exhaustion and medication, but my hearing sharpened in that strange way senses do when a body edges too close to the line between holding on and letting go. I heard everything. Conversations meant to be private. Orders meant to be quietly followed. The rising and falling tones of alarm from the monitors tracking the fragile rhythm of my heart. Somewhere to my left, someone said, "BP still unstable." Another voice responded, "She's fighting, but she's running out of time." I wanted to speak, to ask what they meant, to demand they fix it, stop talking about me like I wasn't in the room, stop treating me like a candle flickering in a draft. But my throat wouldn't move, my tongue wouldn't respond, and my breath felt shallow, thin enough to slip through the smallest crack and disappear. I heard a chair scrape. Footsteps approached. A man's voice, steady, contained, murmured, "I'll call her son. Someone needs to know." That word, son, cut through the haze more sharply than any scalpel. I remained still, trapped inside my motionless body, as the doctor pulled out his phone. I could imagine the gesture without seeing it, the slide of the screen unlock, the practiced efficiency of someone who had made many calls to many families on nights not unlike this one. Then his voice shifted, adopting the professional neutrality I recognized from decades of watching doctors speak when the truth was dire. "Hello? Is this David Walker?" Even in my weakened state, hearing my son's name brought an involuntary response, a faint stirring in my chest, a mother's instinctive reach toward her child, even through pain. Despite our distance, despite the awkwardness that had grown between us over the years like vines crawling over an abandoned fence, a part of me still believed that the sound of his name would pull me back from the brink. "This is Dr. Samuel Grant," the doctor continued. "I'm calling about your mother." My breath hitched. I waited not physically, because my body lay still, but internally holding a fragile hope like a thin thread in trembling fingers. The doctor spoke clearly, each word carved into the air with precision. Your mother is in critical condition. She needs surgery immediately. Without it, she won't survive. The silence that followed stretched so long it felt like a chasm opening beneath me. I tried to imagine my son's face, his reaction, shock, fear, concern. The natural response any child might have when told their mother was one failing heartbeat away from death. But then I heard his voice. Not strained, not frightened, not even alert. No, his voice was light, irritated, drowned beneath music, laughter, clinking glasses, the unmistakable sounds of a celebration. He sounded like a man interrupted by something he considered a nuisance rather than an emergency. Man, he said, dragging out the syllable with the tone of someone inconvenienced by a telemarketer. I'm at my mother-in-law's birthday party. There was a pause, barely long enough for the doctor to respond, before he continued, voice irritated as if he'd been forced to repeat himself. If she dies, just tell me later, okay? And he hung up, just like that. No questions, no hesitation, no ounce of worry. His words sliced through whatever fragile hope I had managed to hold on to. I had braced myself for the worst medically, but nothing prepared me for the blow that came instead from the person I had raised, protected, loved fiercely. Even through years he never bothered to understand me. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. No one spoke, not the nurse who had been adjusting the IV, not the technician who paused mid-step. Even the machine seemed quieter, as if stunned. I felt the tension ripple through the people around me, not pity exactly, but something deeper, heavier, like witnessing a cruelty they couldn't unhear. For a moment, the doctor didn't move. His hand lingered near his phone, suspended in disbelief. Not because he hadn't heard responses like that before. Doctors see the fractures families hide from the world. But because of the bluntness, the coldness, the sheer detachment in my son's voice. It wasn't the words alone. It was the effortless way he delivered them, as though he weren't talking about a woman, a person, but about a delay in the evening's entertainment. I lay there helpless, my mind screaming though my body couldn't react. The shock of impact from the accident had been physical, violent, immediate. But this was a different kind of collision, quieter, deeper. A blow delivered not by metal and speed, but by apathy, the kind that leaves no visible bruises, but fractures something far more fragile than bone. The doctor exhaled slowly, a quiet, controlled breath meant to steady himself. A nurse shifted her weight, her silence laced with disapproval. Someone muttered under their breath, "Unbelievable." But no one looked at me. Maybe they thought I was unconscious. Maybe they thought it would be kinder. But I heard every word. I felt every second. And the silence that followed my son's sentence was louder and crueler than the crash that had nearly killed me. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, the world contracted into a tunnel of motion and sound. Every jolt, every sharp angle of the ambulance's wheels sent spikes of pain racing through my ribs, clawing through my chest, radiating down my arms and legs in cruel, twisting waves. Yet the physical agony, fierce as it was, didn't dominate my thoughts. It was the echo of my son's words, the careless dismissal, the flippant tone, the utter absence of concern that ignited a fire inside me, a furious, burning rage that roared louder than the sirens outside. How could a man I'd raised, fed, protected, and sacrificed for. Hear that my life hung by threads and respond as though it were a minor inconvenience, a scheduling problem to be postponed until later. I clenched my fists against the straps holding me in place. My knuckles whitened. Pain lanced through my arms, but it was secondary. Anger surged with a heat I hadn't felt in years, the kind that makes your stomach churn and your hands tremble. I wanted to scream, not for the pain, not for the ambulance, not for the world, but for him. David, my son, my child, the boy who once ran into my arms when he scraped a knee, who clung to my neck when thunderstorms scared him awake, the same boy who now had the gall to treat my imminent death as a minor interruption in his evening. Lucas, my neighbor and old friend who had arrived at the accident site before anyone else, rode beside me. His hand was steady on my shoulder each time a jolt made my ribs threaten mutiny. His presence, calm and resolute, acted as a tether to reality. He muttered reassurances I barely registered, his voice a steady anchor against the whirlpool of indignation and betrayal consuming me. Yet even his touch, kind and grounded, could not quell the anger swelling inside my chest, twisting and turning like a storm in a confined space. I tried to focus on the rhythm of my breathing. Inhale, exhale. Focus on the ambulance walls rushing past in a blur. But the rhythm fractured each time David's words echoed in my mind. If she dies, just tell me later. Just tell me later. As though my life were a casual aside, a footnote to the celebration of someone else, as though my existence was disposable, negotiable, optional. I could feel humiliation crawling along my spine, knotting with the rage. Humiliation, because this wasn't just indifference. It was callousness, deliberate and casual, a public dismissal I couldn't escape even in the privacy of the ambulance. By the time we reached the hospital, my body was screaming louder than my mind. The paramedics shifted me onto a stretcher again, lifting and repositioning with careful precision. My legs throbbed with dull, unrelenting pressure. My shoulder felt as though it had been wrenched from its socket, and every breath drew fire through the cracked landscape of my ribs. But beneath the pain, beneath the adrenaline, the anger remained, a simmering, unyielding presence that refused to be soothed. The emergency team moved quickly, efficient, and practiced. X-rays revealed the fractured ribs, the dislocated shoulder, and the internal bruising that made every breath a sharp protest. A young nurse glanced at me while scribbling notes on a clipboard. "Who should we call?" she asked, her tone polite, but expecting the obvious answer. I hesitated. The ambulance, the accident, the hospital lights, all of it blurred into a single moment of clarity. And then, with a voice tight from pain and fury, I said, "No one. Don't bother." The nurse blinked, startled. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I said firmly, the words more a declaration than an answer. If Ethan doesn't care when I'm bleeding on the road, he doesn't deserve updates. Not now. Not ever. Lucas glanced at me, his eyes reflecting concern, a question unspoken. I shook my head just enough to indicate I wasn't wavering. The rage that had begun as a flare in the ambulance had hardened into a steely resolve. This was not just anger. It was an awakening. A recognition of the boundaries I had long ignored, the way I had allowed neglect to masquerade as familial duty. My son's callousness had drawn a line, and I would not cross it again. As the doctors and nurses moved around me, adjusting IV lines, preparing analgesics, and discussing surgery logistics, I felt a tense, simmering clarity settle over me. Pain was temporary. Fear could be subdued. Anger, real, raw, indignant anger was lasting. It burned beneath my skin, coiling tight, fueling my awareness, sharpening my mind. I could feel the injustice of the moment like a physical weight pressing against my chest, almost rivaling the pain from my fractured ribs. Lucas squeezed my hand, murmuring quietly, trying to reassure me. But I barely heard him, lost in the relentless cadence of my own thoughts. I thought of David again, the ease with which he had discarded me, the ease with which he had rendered a life-or-death moment irrelevant, and I knew, even as a surgeon's instruments hummed nearby and monitors blinked their coded alarms, that anger had become my companion, a relentless witness to the betrayal, a quiet fire that would not be extinguished. Pain would pass. Surgery would heal my body. But the humiliation, the bitter, unyielding realization that my own son could treat me as optional, would linger, curling like smoke around every thought, every memory, every heartbeat. And in that awareness, as my body was tended to with clinical precision, my mind coiled tighter around a single, undeniable truth. Anger was no longer just a reaction. It was a shield, a promise, a warning that I would not be invisible, not ever again. The hospital days blurred into one another, not in a haze of monotony, but in the slow, methodical rhythms of healing. The kind of healing that doesn't just involve bones knitting and bruises fading, but the quieter, less visible work of piecing together the remnants of a heart shaken loose from its foundations. Pain was ever present, sharp when I moved, dull when I didn't, but it wasn't the only sensation inhabiting my body anymore. There was something else, something gentler, something almost startling in its presence, the sense that someone cared. That someone was Lucas. He wasn't family, not by blood, not by marriage, not by obligation. Just a neighbor, a friend, a man who had rushed toward the wreckage of my car long before my own son even bothered to return a call. He came between shifts at the fire station, still smelling faintly of smoke and engine grease, carrying things he thought might make my room feel a little less sterile, a little less like a place one merely survived in. He brought me tea first, a blend he knew I liked, because he'd once asked what helped me sleep during stormy nights when the wind battered our windows. It was a simple act, but when he placed the steaming cup onto the rolling tray beside my bed, something warm pressed against my ribs, settling in the spaces that anger had carved hollow. Then he brought books, old paperbacks with cracked spines, dog-eared by the hands of people who had loved them before us. He read with a patience that surprised me, his voice deep but soft enough not to strain my already frayed nerves. Sometimes he read just a page or two before I drifted off, the steady cadence of his voice tugging me into sleep smoother than any pain medication the doctors offered. But the moment that shifted something fundamental happened on the third day. He walked in with a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth, holding his phone like a secret. "I thought you might want to see some familiar faces," he said. Before I could ask, he tapped the screen and positioned the phone in my hands. Suddenly, the room exploded with chaos, happy chaos. Barking, wagging tails, wet noses pressed eagerly against the camera. The pups from the shelter where I volunteered every week, my little misfit family. My heart lurched painfully, but not from injury. From affection so fierce it brought tears to my eyes. "Lucas Howe," I began. He shrugged, trying to smother a smile. "They missed you. And well, you needed them." I didn't realize until then how tightly I'd been holding everything inside, fear, anger, humiliation, clenched like a fist inside my chest. Seeing those dogs, hearing their noises, feeling their joy through the tiny screen, cracked something open. My breath trembled, ribs protesting, but I didn't care. For the first time since the accident, something inside me softened. You don't need someone biologically connected to care about you, a small voice whispered in the back of my mind. A voice timid, tentative, filled with truth I wasn't ready to claim but couldn't ignore. Lucas stayed while I laughed softly at the dog's antics. When one of the puppies pawed at the camera and nearly knocked the phone out of the shelter volunteer's hands, I snorted, a laugh mixed with pain, but a laugh nonetheless. Lucas reacted like it was a personal victory. "See," he said, "still got that spark." I rolled my eyes at him, but it didn't hide the warmth blooming beneath my sternum. Still, even as relief brushed gently against the edges of my mind, another voice lurked deeper, darker, heavy with truth I wished I didn't recognize. A voice that growled, "Your own child discarded you like an inconvenience." The contrast was unbearable. Here was Lucas, a man with his own life, his own burdens, who owed me nothing, showing up with compassion, with thoughtfulness, with genuine care that came without expectation. And then there was David, my son, who couldn't be bothered to pause a party long enough to acknowledge that his mother might die before midnight. The two realities clashed inside me, creating a storm I couldn't escape. Every time Lucas handed me a book, or adjusted my pillows, or coaxed me into sipping broth when my appetite vanished, the gentle relief he brought collided with the violent memory of David's words. The warmth and the wound sat side by side, refusing to integrate into anything coherent. I wanted to feel gratitude, pure, uncomplicated gratitude, but grief tangled around it, sharp and barbed. How could a stranger care more than my own child? How had I become so easy to cast aside in David's eyes? Why did one man step forward while the one who shared my blood disappeared into indifference? Lucas noticed the moments when my smile faltered. He didn't pry, didn't push. He simply placed a hand on mine, grounding me with a steady, reassuring presence that spoke louder than any question. "You're not alone," he said once, voice low, not dramatic, simply true. And that truth settled over me like a fragile blanket, light enough to comfort, heavy enough to matter. But as soon as he left each evening, as the quiet swallowed the room and the machines hummed their lonely nighttime lullaby, the other truth slithered back in. Your own child discarded you like an inconvenience. The sentence pulsed beneath my skin, a bruise deeper than the ones marking my ribs. And though Lucas brought relief, brought warmth, brought unexpected light into my fractured world, the shadow of that betrayal remained. Two truths. One soft, one devastating. And I lay there in the dim hospital room, caught between both, grateful for the kindness that lifted me, and haunted by the cruelty that broke me. The first sensation was pain. Sharp, insistent, like a bell ringing directly into my ribs. My eyes fluttered, unwillingly, as if the very act of seeing would demand a strength I wasn't sure I possessed. Then came the sterile scent, the acrid tang of antiseptic, the faint metallic undertone that made my stomach clench. For a long moment, I didn't know where I was, who I was, or why the world felt so impossibly heavy. Somewhere in the blurred haze of consciousness, I realized I was breathing, shallowly, unevenly, each intake of air a minor victory. I wanted to move, to call out, to grasp at the reassuring voices that had tended me, but my body refused, bound in pain and weakness. The hospital room was silent except for the low hum of machines, the soft beeping of monitors that counted my heartbeats as if reminding me that life, against all odds, persisted. I opened my eyes fully and met a figure I knew only professionally, a face from past emergencies, a man whose presence had always been calm, authoritative, and just distant enough to seem untouchable. Dr. Grant. He sat in the chair beside my bed, his posture relaxed, almost casual, but his eyes were calculating, layered with some knowledge I did not yet possess. The corners of his mouth lifted into a smile that did not belong to relief, nor to the satisfaction of a saved patient. It was something quieter, subtler, something that unnerved me in a way fear had not in the previous hours. I tried to speak, my throat raw, my voice a cracked whisper. "Doctor?" "Well, Mary," he said softly, each syllable deliberate, measured, weighted. "Your son has no idea who you really are, does he?" I froze. The words struck me not like a revelation, but like ice poured over my veins, crawling downward, seizing every nerve in their path. My heart leaped, not in relief, not in recognition, but in alarm. My thoughts scrambled, violent and incoherent. Who knew? What did he mean? My son. No, David. He had said those words, those impossible, brutal words. What secret could possibly twist their meaning into something else? "Doctor, I don't understand," I rasped. My voice was a hoarse croak that sounded alien even to me. Dr. Grant's smile remained, subtle but unwavering, a dangerous calm. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, fingers laced. "It's complicated," he said, as though complexity could somehow soften the impact of whatever he was about to reveal. "But you're awake now, and that's what matters. The rest, well, it will make sense in time." Sense. The word landed like a stone in the pit of my stomach. My mind refused to move forward, trapped in the echo of David's words. He doesn't care," I whispered almost to myself. The images of that call replayed relentlessly. His laughter, his indifference, the music in the background, the casual dismissal of my life as if it were a minor inconvenience. He doesn't care about me. Dr. Grant's gaze sharpened, as if he had anticipated my thoughts. "Mary," he said, softer now, almost gentle, "there's more to the story than that. He isn't what you think he is, or rather he doesn't know what you are." I felt a shiver crawl down my arm, icy and insistent, coiling around my spine and pressing into the marrow of my bones. I tried to speak again, but no words emerged. My mind spun in tight circles, trying to catch the slippery strands of meaning hidden in his calm tone. "I don't understand," I said again, more insistently. "You will," he said, "and when you do, you might feel anger, disbelief, even fear. That's natural. But for now, just know this. You survived. You're here. And that knowledge, that simple, undeniable truth, gives you something David doesn't have." My breathing hitched. Survival. My chest tightened as I processed the words. Every fragmented memory of the accident, the pain, the fear, the terrifying silence after David's call, the slow, careful presence of Lucas, all of it funneled into a single searing point. I was alive, but alive with a new awareness, a latent understanding that something fundamental had shifted. Dr. Grant's expression remained unreadable, a mask of calm patience, but I sensed the subtle intensity beneath it, the weight of knowledge he held tightly, not for himself, but for me. The hum of the machines, the antiseptic tang in the air, the rhythmic beeping of my heartbeat, they all receded into a quiet background, as though the entire universe had paused to let me absorb the enormity of that single chilling sentence. Your son has no idea who you really are. I tried to move, to sit up, but my body reminded me that it had been broken, tested to its limits, and had endured far more than I had realized. Still, the fire ignited in my chest was not just pain. It was curiosity, disbelief, a wild, irrepressible urge to unravel the secret that Dr. Grant carried so lightly. I felt the threads of anger, betrayal, and helplessness coiling tighter, but beneath them was something else, a spark of anticipation of awakening. For the first time in days, I felt fully conscious, fully aware, fully alive. And with that consciousness came a shiver of something both exhilarating and terrifying, the realization that the truth, when it came, would change everything. The chill running down my arm was more than cold. It was the tremor of destiny stirring. And I knew, deep in the marrow of my 68-year-old bones, that nothing would ever be the same again. I blinked at him, confusion cutting through the fog of pain and exhaustion. The sterile hospital lights seemed to blur, sharpen, and blur again as my mind struggled to grasp the meaning behind his words. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice hoarse, brittle like a twig snapping in a storm. Dr. Grant leaned closer, just enough to pierce the barrier of my stupor. His eyes held that calm, meticulous intensity he always carried, the kind that hinted he was used to being the keeper of other people's secrets. But this time, the secret was mine. "When I looked up your medical history," he said slowly, deliberately, "I found your old records. From before you legally became Mary Walker. From the time when you were living under a different name. The military clearance, the classified documentation." My pulse accelerated despite the injury, a chaotic rhythm hammering in my chest. I tried to form words, but none came. My mind recoiled, skipping through fragments of a life I had deliberately buried. Memories I had locked away for decades began to rise like old ghosts, shimmering, sharp, untouchable. Dr. Grant's eyes narrowed, a spark of something I couldn't immediately identify flashing in their depths. Curiosity, respect, awe. "You're that Mary Walker," he continued, voice hushed but firm, carrying the weight of revelation. "The field nurse from Operation Sentinel. The woman who saved 12 soldiers under enemy fire." I froze. 12 soldiers. Names, faces, the cacophony of battle, shouts, screams, explosions, the stink of smoke and blood, flooded my mind unbidden. My hands, though swollen and bruised, clenched involuntarily at the sheets beneath me. That past life was not a story I had ever shared, not even with David. Not even to hint that his mother, the quiet, unassuming woman who baked cookies on weekends and tucked him in at night, had once carried lives in her arms while bullets tore through the air around her. I felt a trembling rush of anger, a visceral protectiveness toward the secret I had kept all these years. That life, that version of me, had existed to keep him safe, to shield him from the fear, the chaos, the knowledge that his mother had faced death as a constant companion, and not always her own. I had sacrificed recognition, friendships, relationships, even intimacy, to construct a simple, predictable life for my family. And now here it was, unearthed by someone else, draped over my head like a thundercloud. You found out," I said finally, my voice still fragile, yet trembling with rising fury. "Without me saying a word, you dug into a part of my life I buried to protect my son." Dr. Grant's gaze softened, but his tone did not waver. "I didn't dig to expose you. I did it because of the emergency. We needed to understand your medical history. Your records were classified, so I had to follow protocol. But what I found, it changed everything. It gave context to your resilience, your recovery, your reactions, and honestly, it explained why your son reacted the way he did when I called him. The words hit me like an unexpected blow. He didn't just know my past, he understood its implications. David's call, his casual dismissal of my life, now had an edge of tragic irony. He didn't know the woman lying in that hospital bed was capable of enduring what she had endured. He had never met the Mary Walker who ran into gunfire, who stabilized a soldier bleeding out on a jungle floor with nothing but adrenaline, skill, and sheer willpower. He had never known that the quiet domestic woman he took for granted was forged from a crucible of danger and survival. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, a strange cocktail of fear, anger, and awe swirling in my chest. I never told him. I admitted softly, almost whispering, almost confessing to the sterile ceiling above. Not about Sentinel. Not about the missions. Not about his father. I wanted him to grow up safe, knowing nothing of war, nothing of danger. I thought it was my duty. Dr. Grant nodded slowly, respect in the crease of his brow. You did more than your duty. You kept him alive in a way no battlefield nurse could. But that past, it exists, and it's part of you, Mary. He doesn't know that, but now, the truth has a way of rising to the surface, whether we want it to or not. I lay back, the weight of decades pressing down on me. My bones ached, my heart ached, but the deeper ache was one of recognition of the life I had lived, the choices I had made, the person I had become. Mary Walker, field nurse, mother, protector, survivor. The life I had carefully hidden, preserved, and disguised was no longer a secret to someone else, and the implications of that revelation, poised in the quiet intensity of Dr. Grant's eyes, were impossible to ignore. I realized then that the world I had built for David, carefully insulated and sanitized, was on the brink of collision with a past I had thought safely buried. The knowledge Dr. Grant now held was a key that could unlock questions, consequences, judgments I had long avoided. And beneath the surface, an unexpected thrill stirred. The awareness that the woman David had dismissed so casually was not the woman the world, or he, believed her to be. I clenched my jaw, feeling the old, familiar steel ignite inside me, the same resolve that had carried me through jungles, battlefields, and hospitals in conflict zones around the world. My past was alive, and it had not left me weak. It had made me stronger, sharper, more unyielding. And now, with Dr. Grant's revelation hovering between us, I understood that my life, both the one I had lived publicly and the one I had hidden, was about to assert itself in ways I had never anticipated. For the first time since the accident, the dull ache of betrayal and the sting of my son's indifference merged with a spark of empowerment. Mary Walker, the survivor, the mother, the field nurse, was awake, and the truth he had discovered was only the beginning. Dr. Grant's words settled over me like a dense, suffocating fog. And your son, the man you protected from the ugliness of the world, told us not to bother him if you died. He said, disbelief threading each syllable, soft yet undeniable, like the echo of a slap against my ribs. I felt it first as a flicker of disbelief, a short-circuiting in my mind. Then came the heat, slow and corrosive, spreading through my chest and stomach until it sank into my bones. My hands, bruised and swollen from the accident, gripped the edges of the hospital bed sheets until the fabric creased and tore. I wanted to scream, to hurl words sharp and shattering, but my voice, hoarse and fragile, barely managed a whisper. I had survived the horrors of war, standing on scorched earth where screams and gunfire merged into a single, unrelenting rhythm. I had watched men bleed out in my arms, felt the sticky weight of panic pressed down like concrete, and yet, even in those moments, I had never known betrayal like this. Not from a soldier, not from an enemy, not from the chaos of life itself, but from the son I had carried, nurtured, and protected as if he were the most precious thing in the universe. The hospital room was silent, the only sound the soft beeping of monitors, the faint rustle of nurses moving beyond the glass doors, and the distant hum of ventilation. And yet inside me, a storm raged, loud and furious, each beat of my heart hammering against the cage of my ribs like a relentless drum. I could taste the anger, bitter and acrid, burning the back of my throat. I thought of the countless nights I had stayed awake beside him when he was sick, holding a favored child in my arms, whispering comfort even when I was exhausted beyond comprehension. I remembered every scraped knee, every heartbreak, every trembling moment when he needed guidance and protection, and I had given it without hesitation. Every single sacrifice, every decision made in his best interest, had been in service of this one goal: keeping him safe, shielding him from the cruel truths of the world and from the legacy of my past. And now that same son, the one I had guarded as if my own life depended on it, had dismissed me with a single thoughtless sentence. "If she dies, tell me later." Those words replayed in my mind over and over, each repetition a hammer striking raw nerves. I clenched my jaw so hard it ached, the pain slicing through my awareness like a warning. My mind flashed through years of memory, contrasting each tender moment with this act of callous indifference. I saw the Christmas mornings, the scraped elbows, the late-night conversations in a dimly lit kitchen, the tears and laughter intertwined. I had survived loss, devastation, and fear, but never the knowledge that someone I had loved and sacrificed for could so casually discard my life, as though it were nothing more than an inconvenient chore. The anger didn't come all at once. It began as a flicker, a spark igniting in the depths of my chest, then grew, relentless and uncontainable, like wildfire consuming a dry forest. My pulse quickened, every vein in my neck and arms standing out as I struggled against the incredulity and betrayal coiling within me. I wanted to curse him, to scream his name until the walls themselves shook, to make him feel even a fraction of the cold, cutting emptiness his words had left behind. I thought of Lucas, the friend who had sat beside me, who had brought warmth, care, and attention to a hospital room filled with sterile efficiency and indifferent strangers. Lucas had offered concern without expectation, devotion without judgment, and my son, my own flesh and blood, had chosen to prioritize a birthday party over the survival of the woman who had risked everything for him, who had shaped the very foundation of his life. Beneath the fury, beneath the sting of rejection, I felt a tremor of sadness, not a tearful sorrow, but a heavy, sinking recognition of the gap between what I had given and what I had received in return. The realization cut sharper than any fracture, sharper than the metal that had crushed my legs hours ago. I closed my eyes, letting the silence of the room absorb me, focusing on the rise and fall of my chest, the ache of my broken body, and the fury simmering beneath. The anger wasn't just for the words, for the callous dismissal, or even for the selfishness of a son who couldn't see beyond his convenience. It was anger for the years of love, labor, and sacrifice that had gone unrecognized, for the trust placed in someone who had never understood the weight of what I had carried for him. And yet, As the heat of fury coursed through me, it was not blind or chaotic. It was focused, precise, almost clinical, like the kind of controlled determination I had cultivated in far more dangerous circumstances. It was the anger of a survivor, tempered by decades of experience, sharp and unstoppable, ready to demand acknowledgement, to carve truth from indifference. Dr. Grant watched me carefully, sensing the shift in my energy, perhaps understanding the depth of what had just been revealed. But I didn't need his understanding. I didn't need anyone's explanation. The anger, pure and potent, was mine, and it had a clarity that demanded recognition. I had survived wars, losses, disasters, and now I would survive the cold betrayal of my own child. Mary Walker was not a woman to be discarded quietly. That much was certain. The folder thudded onto the bed with a weight that made me flinch, though I was unsure whether it was from the impact or from the sudden gravity in Dr. Grant's expression. He didn't speak at first, only adjusted his posture in the stiff hospital chair at the foot of my bed, the quiet hum of monitors filling the silence like a taut string vibrating under tension. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but unwavering, carrying an authority that commanded attention. "Your records will remain confidential," he said, "but you need to know one thing. You are not alone, Mary." The words landed like a lifeline tossed into turbulent waters. I stared at him, my bruised and battered body still aching from the accident, my mind spinning with memories, anger, and disbelief. I wanted to laugh, bitterly, at the irony of being 68, wounded and fragile, and still learning that someone I had never expected, was willing to care for me as a person, not just as a patient. Dr. Grant didn't leave it at words. He came every day, sometimes twice, sometimes more, depending on the rhythm of the hospital schedule. He knew when I had slept poorly, when my medication needed adjustment, when my bruises were threatening infection. But it wasn't only medical oversight. He spoke to me, listened to me, acknowledged the layers beneath the surface. He asked about my childhood with quiet curiosity, asked about the small victories in my life, the quiet triumphs I had never considered remarkable. And when he found me attempting to hobble to the bathroom too soon, he called me soldier with a wry smile, shaking his head, and the nickname, an echo of the life I had long buried, felt like recognition, respect, and humor all wrapped into one. Lucas had been kind, attentive, a comfort in the immediate aftermath, but Dr. Grant's presence was something different. It was deliberate, a consistent reminder that someone saw me fully, that someone didn't measure my worth by convenience or by the indifference of a son who had refused to rise to the occasion. He saw me for what I was, a survivor, a woman whose past held shadows most people wouldn't dare to look into, whose presence had mattered in ways few could grasp. At first I resisted, not consciously, but instinctively. Trust had been eroded too many times over the decades, by friends, lovers, colleagues, and most painfully, by the person who carried my blood. I wanted to pull back, to maintain distance, to guard myself against another potential wound. Yet Dr. Grant was patient. He never pushed. He never pried. He simply remained, offering quiet companionship in the sterile, often impersonal hospital corridors. The rhythm of his visits became an anchor in my days, something to hold onto when the nausea of pain and betrayal threatened to overwhelm me. I watched him in those quiet moments, how he adjusted the IV lines, checked my vitals with the precision of someone who respected life as much as procedure, how he remembered the smallest details of my preferences. The tea I liked, the books I enjoyed, the way my hands shook when I tried to read too quickly. These acts, subtle and deliberate, built a scaffolding around me that I hadn't realized I needed. He didn't just treat the injury, he treated the person, and in doing so, he reminded me that the world could still contain kindness, even at the edge of cynicism. There were evenings when the ward emptied, the fluorescent lights dimmed, and the hushed chatter of nurses faded into silence. Those were the moments when I felt the full weight of my isolation, the sting of my son's indifference. But even then, I would glance at the chair where Dr. Grant had left his coat or notebook, and it was enough to remind me that someone had chosen to care. I felt a strange, cautious warmth that I hadn't felt in years, an acknowledgement that the world, even when cruel, could offer an ally. And respect. For the first time in decades, I felt seen. Not as a fragile elderly woman, not as a patient defined by fractures and bruises, not as someone whose past was a closed chapter best left unmentioned. I was seen as Mary Walker, soldier, mother, survivor, human. That recognition was a balm, subtle yet potent, knitting together the frayed edges of confidence and dignity that the accident and my son's callousness had torn apart. It was astonishing how much the simple act of being acknowledged could anchor someone, could infuse hope into fractured bones and spirit alike. Dr. Grant didn't have to say more than a few words, didn't have to force gestures of attention or concern. Presence, consistency, genuine respect. These were the threads weaving a new sense of stability beneath the tremors of anger and betrayal I carried. I realized then slowly that the world had not entirely abandoned me. There were still those who would fight for me quietly, insist on my dignity, insist I be seen, fully and without reservation. And in that realization, my chest expanded with something I had not felt in years, a tentative, fragile yet undeniable relief. I was not alone. I would survive this too. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and paper, a sterile scent that had begun to feel almost comforting over the past few days. I lay propped on pillows, ribs still aching, shoulders stiff, every breath a reminder that survival came with a price. I had become attuned to the rhythm of the hospital, the quiet hum of the monitors, the footsteps of nurses, the occasional beep of machinery that marked the passage of my fragile existence. And yet, when the door swung open with that hesitant creak, I felt a spike of tension that no painkillers could dull. David stepped inside, dragging his feet, awkward and ill at ease. In his hands were flowers, small, wilted, obviously bought in a hurry from the nearest gas station. The kind of gesture that said, without words, I'm here because I was supposed to be. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened as if he'd thrown it on without thought, and he avoided my gaze, looking anywhere but at me. "Hey, Mom, heard you had some kind of accident." His tone was light, almost casual, as if the magnitude of my near-death experience were merely a rumor to be acknowledged politely at a party. Some kind, I thought bitterly. Some kind of accident that had shattered my bones, nearly ended my life, and left me staring up at the ceiling wondering how someone I raised could treat survival as optional. I opened my mouth, words sharp and ready to strike, but they froze in my throat. Perhaps it was the shock of seeing him after days of his absence, or perhaps the restraint I had been forced to cultivate through decades of discipline and pain. He set the flowers down on the small table beside my bed, glancing at them as if the gesture would absolve him. "So, you good? I mean, you look fine now." His eyes flicked over my bruised face, the bandages on my shoulder, the way I shifted slightly to avoid pain. Fine. My voice could not carry the venom I felt. The truth, the simmering, burning truth, was that I was far from fine. But I let the silence speak for me. Before I could articulate the storm inside, the door opened again, sharper this time, more deliberate. Dr. Grant entered, his presence as commanding as a general inspecting troops. There was no warmth in his tone, only the measured steel of someone accustomed to facing life-and-death situations with precision and unflinching clarity. "Your mother almost died," he said, voice low but cutting, each word deliberate, striking like the edge of a blade. "And you couldn't be bothered to answer a call unless she was already dead." David froze, and the color drained from his face. He opened his mouth to speak, and for a moment it seemed he would try to argue, to justify, to wriggle out of the reality pressing down on him. "Look, man, you don't know my family, my wife." Dr. Grant didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "I know exactly who your mother is. Do you?" The question landed with the force of a hammer striking stone, and David blinked, caught off guard. He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time I saw the flicker of uncertainty, of recognition that something in this room was bigger than his casual indifference. But the understanding didn't come fully. He remained clueless, as if the decades of my life, the courage, the sacrifices, the near impossible choices I had made, were invisible to him. I felt my pulse quicken, a mix of anger, disbelief, and sorrow twisting into a tight knot in my chest. I wanted to tell him everything in that instant, to pour out the truths I had kept buried for his safety, for my dignity, for the life I had tried to shield him from. I wanted him to feel the weight of every battle I had survived, every sleepless night, every tear I had swallowed while raising him alone. But the words didn't come, not yet. The moment was too raw, too jagged. David shuffled his feet, clearly aware for the first time that he was out of his depth. The flowers on the table seemed pitiful, almost comical, compared to the gravity of what hung in the air. He looked between Dr. Grant and me, searching desperately for some anchor, some explanation, some permission to step back from the enormity of what he had ignored. But there was none. The silence stretched, heavy and unyielding, filled only by the faint whir of the ventilator-like hum from the monitors. Every second emphasized the distance he had placed between us with his absence. Every heartbeat a reminder of how easily he had chosen convenience over family, party over mother, trivial social obligations over life itself. Dr. Grant's gaze didn't waver. Mine did not either. In that moment, the room became a crucible of truth, and David, for all his excuses and hesitation, could no longer escape the stark reality. He had failed, and the consequences were impossible to ignore. He blinked again, and I saw the faintest shadow of comprehension, a spark that might one day grow into understanding. But for now, he remained clueless. And I, battered, bruised, and nearly broken, realized that no apology or excuse could erase the truth. He had arrived, but the reckoning had only just begun. The hospital room felt unusually quiet after David stormed out. The monitors beeped steadily, a mundane rhythm that contrasted sharply with the firestorm he had just ignited. Dr. Grant leaned against the edge of my bed, arms crossed, eyes calm but sharp, and for a moment I let myself simply breathe. Not because the pain had vanished. My shoulders still throbbed, my ribs protested every movement, but because a sense of satisfaction, cold and precise, began to settle in. Dr. Grant didn't need to explain my history, and he didn't. His words alone carried the weight of judgment that David had earned. She deserved better than the way you treated her. And one day, you'll realize it. There was no need for lectures, no need for the long history of sacrifices, no need to lay out the decades of resilience and courage that had defined my life. Those truths were heavy, and they clung to the room like a quiet, invisible verdict. David had sputtered, his face red, his hands trembling slightly as if he had just realized the consequences of his casual cruelty. I was busy. His excuses fell flat, dissipating in the sterile air. Dr. Grant's calmness was a dam holding back the flood of my own restrained fury. But it was a dam that didn't break. It allowed the truth to land like shards of glass without adding more noise. And then he left, stormed, really. Out the door, past the nurse's station, past the visitors' chairs, straight into the waiting area. His wife trailed behind, whispering something sharp and cutting about me, her words dripping with disdain and assumption. She didn't see Nurse Reynolds leaning against the counter, ears wide, eyes narrowing at the cruelty. I heard her whispers, faint but precise, a combination of venom and misplaced loyalty. Within minutes, the ripple of their behavior had traveled faster than I could have imagined. A few nurses exchanged knowing glances, the kind that communicate a shared understanding without words. Doctors passing by paused, their steps slowing as they noted the tension. Even the janitorial staff, often invisible in the hospital's ecosystem, raised eyebrows and whispered quietly to one another. By the time David and his wife left the hospital entirely, leaving behind a faint trail of embarrassment and arrogance, the staff and a handful of visiting families had witnessed enough to form silent judgments. I won't pretend it was subtle. Watching them leave, realizing that the whispers had made their arrogance transparent, that their facade of normalcy was crumbling under the weight of their own indifference, it felt deeply satisfying. Not maliciously satisfying in the petty sense, but as a validation of a principle I had lived by. Justice has its own rhythm, and it doesn't always need my hand to deliver it. The irony settled in a slow, simmering way. David had thought his mother's suffering could be postponed, that an inconvenient call could be avoided for an evening of comfort and celebration. His arrogance had blinded him to a simple truth. Actions have consequences and choices, even the ones wrapped in excuses, carry weight beyond what one imagines. Watching him confronted with the repercussions of neglect, the momentary sting of exposure and shame, was a strange, almost righteous relief. Dr. Grant observed quietly, leaning back against the foot of my bed, his expression unreadable, but approving in the subtlest of ways. "They'll think twice before treating anyone like that again," he said softly, almost to himself. The comment wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about me feeling superior. It was about the undeniable alignment of consequence and character. David's indifference had finally collided with reality, and the collision was as precise as any tactical maneuver I had ever orchestrated in my past life. I allowed myself a small, private smile, one that didn't reach out to anyone but lived inside me. For years, I had cultivated restraint, enduring slights, neglect, and the weight of being underestimated. I had survived war zones, personal losses, betrayal, and the loneliness of raising a child who now revealed the shallow measure of his regard. This moment, watching the natural justice of embarrassment and exposure play out, was, for the first time in decades, an unfiltered acknowledgement that the scales had tilted, even if briefly. There was no malice in my satisfaction, only recognition. Justice, when served cold, is sharper than any anger. It slices quietly, leaving its mark without need for confrontation. David had walked out, convinced he had escaped any real consequence, but the stares, the whispers, the quiet judgment of everyone around him were wounds far more enduring than a shouted argument. And unlike the physical pain I had endured in the accident, this moment required no healing. It existed perfectly in its own right, a simple, unvarnished truth reflected in the mirror of human behavior. I leaned back against my pillows, letting the sensations of the room, the steady beeps, the smell of antiseptic, the warmth of the sunlight spilling through the blinds, wash over me. I felt a strange lightness, a detachment from the anger that had roiled inside me since the call to David. The scales, however briefly, had balanced themselves. The injustice had struck back, and I was allowed for this moment to witness it fully. And it felt good. The first time in a long while, the world seemed, if only slightly, aligned with fairness. Recovery was a slow, relentless process. Every morning, waking up meant facing pain that crept like icy fingers into my bones. My shoulder protested each movement. My ribs whispered in sharp reminders of the night. My world had tilted sideways, and even the simplest tasks, pouring tea, brushing my hair, felt like feats of endurance. But for the first time in years, I wasn't doing it alone. Dr. Grant was there, always present, not hovering, not pitying, but steady, like a lighthouse that never wavered in a storm. He guided me through physical therapy, gently correcting my posture when my pride made me push too hard. He brought me books, anecdotes from his own life, and a humor so dry it cut through the tension of hospital walls. Slowly, meticulously, he reminded me that pain was not weakness, and healing was not a race. He also helped me navigate the bureaucratic labyrinth I had long avoided. I had never claimed the veteran benefits I was entitled to. Filing papers, making calls, tracking down old service records, it was exhausting, infuriating even, but Dr. Grant was there every step, his calm presence turning what should have been daunting into manageable steps. I rediscovered programs designed for veterans, for women like me, women whose sacrifices had been invisible, whose courage had been quietly worn like armor that no one ever saw. He encouraged me to reclaim what I had long buried, my identity, my skills, the pride of the life I had lived before motherhood and domestic routine had buried it under years of quiet obligation. The world outside my hospital room began to shift, not in grand proclamations, but in subtle, empowering ways. I met other women at therapy sessions who had faced the kind of invisible wars I knew too well, the ones fought in silence, in service, in the background while life carried on for everyone else. Sharing stories, laughing quietly at memories that were both horrific and oddly triumphant, I realized that my sense of isolation had been a choice of circumstance, not fate. There was a network, a web of support that had existed while I thought I was alone, and for the first time, I let myself belong to it. David's name came up occasionally. He called, of course, trying to explain, fumbling for words that could not undo the weight of his past indifference. Each message began with hesitation, then awkward apologies, and attempts at casual explanations, as if convenience had been the ultimate arbiter of morality. But now I had the luxury of perspective. I wasn't the frantic, bleeding woman on the pavement anymore. I wasn't the frightened mother dependent on the compassion of anyone else. I had strength, endurance, clarity, and most importantly, choice. I could respond, or I could remain silent. I could permit him back into my life, or I could let him continue to exist as someone who had once chosen celebration over me. The decision wasn't cruel. It was liberation. For decades, I had been the invisible anchor, the silent provider, the mother whose sacrifices were taken as granted. I had endured heartbreak, disappointment, and subtle betrayals without acknowledgement. And now, for the first time, the balance had shifted. I wasn't obligated to offer love or forgiveness simply because biology demanded it. I could choose the people, the experiences, the relationships that enriched my life rather than depleted it. Reclaiming my identity as Mary Walker veteran, survivor was more than symbolic. It was a reclamation of the self I had carefully tucked away for decades. I reconnected with old comrades, attended local veterans gatherings, and even participated in programs for young women in the military, sharing lessons learned under fire, lessons about courage, resilience, and integrity. Each handshake, each conversation, each acknowledgement of my service felt like a stitch in a tapestry that had long been frayed, slowly being mended into a pattern that belonged to me and me alone. The solitude that once terrified me now felt empowering. I could stand alone without fear, without the weight of invisible expectation. And yet, for the first time, I recognized that standing alone didn't mean standing isolated. I had allies, friends, mentors, and communities that honored my existence without demanding submission or gratitude in exchange. The world was not a battlefield I had to face silently anymore. It was a network of people who had chosen to recognize strength and perseverance. People who saw Mary Walker as more than just a mother or an aging survivor. They saw her as a force. David's calls became background noise, persistent, sometimes guilt-laden, occasionally clumsy, but irrelevant to the core of my awakening. I had learned that life's debts are not repaid by mere words, especially after years of neglect. My intention was no longer a currency to be exploited. My presence was no longer a guarantee for others' convenience. I had survived far too much to allow a casual indifference to diminish the reality of my existence. And so, in the quiet of my newly arranged apartment, where sunlight fell across books, medals, photos, and plants I had nurtured myself, I felt the culmination of a life reclaimed. Each breath carried history, survival, pain, and triumph all at once. I was Mary Walker. I had faced death, indifference, and betrayal. I had emerged stronger, wiser, and unshackled. I had reclaimed the story that had always belonged to me. For the first time, I didn't stand alone out of necessity. I stood alone out of choice, and that difference, subtle as it seemed, was everything. I am Mary Walker, survivor, veteran, woman, and this time, when I stand, I do so surrounded by truth, strength, and the life I finally get to define. And this time, I'm done standing alone.